The United States is not broke, but it is trapped. Every year, the country grows richer on paper and poorer in freedom. The numbers look abstract until you follow where they lead. As of late 2024, U.S. federal debt passed the size of the entire economy, according to Treasury and IMF data, crossing the point where the government owes more than the nation produces in a year. Markets barely flinched. Stocks hovered near record highs. Political speeches stayed upbeat. The calm is the first clue. When danger is visible, people react. When danger is structural, they adjust and call it stability. What makes this moment unsettling isn't the size of the debt alone. It's the way it has been absorbed into daily life. The Federal Reserve now sends more money to bondholders in interest than the government spends on many public priorities. In fiscal year 2024, interest costs pushed past the trillion-dollar mark, a figure confirmed by the Congressional Budget Office and echoed in Fed minutes. That money doesn't build roads, train workers, or lower taxes. It services the past. The system still functions, but the margin for choice keeps shrinking. The contradiction sits in plain sight. Equity markets signal confidence while the real economy slows. The Bureau of Economic Analysis shows growth rates cooling even as borrowing accelerates. The BIS has warned repeatedly over the last year about advanced economies relying on debt rollover rather than repayment, a quiet shift with loud consequences. Short-term Treasury bills now dominate new issuance, creating a maturity wall that must be refinanced again and again at higher rates. The FDIC, in its 2024 reports, flagged how this pressure seeps into banks, pension funds, and municipal budgets. None of this looks like collapse. It looks like constraint. This matters now because debt doesn't destroy nations by blowing up. It destroys them by narrowing the field of possible decisions until every path leads to the same place. Taxes rise, or inflation absorbs the difference. Spending cuts arrive, or social strain fills the gap. Defense, healthcare, housing, every debate in Washington is already fenced in by obligations made years ago. Politicians argue inside a box that keeps getting smaller, even if no one names it. History leaves a paper trail for this kind of moment. Rome didn't fall when it debased its currency. It fell when debasement became routine. Weimar Germany didn't lose control when prices first rose. It lost control when confidence collapsed after policymakers chose delay over discipline. The bridge to the present is not rhetorical. The IMF's most recent Article 4 review of the United States warned that persistent deficits during full employment lock future governments into harsher trade-offs. Different era, same mechanism. This story isn't ideological, it isn't partisan, it's structural. What's happening to the United States has happened before, under different flags and different leaders, and it followed a pattern. The trap is not hidden, it's normalized, and it reaches all the way into your bank account, whether you've been told to watch for it or not. The pressure doesn't arrive as a headline, it arrives as a receipt. Inflation is said to be cooling, yet the cost of living keeps climbing in ways that don't show up cleanly in press releases. Grocery prices remain structurally higher than they were 3 years ago. Insurance premiums, home, auto, health, have jumped again, confirmed in recent Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Rent hasn't fallen in most metro areas. It has merely stopped accelerating. For households, the slowdown doesn't feel like relief. It feels like being locked into a higher baseline with no exit ramp. Housing is where the strain becomes unmistakable. Mortgage rates more than doubled from their pandemic lows, while prices never reset. The result is paralysis. The Federal Housing Finance Agency shows affordability at levels last seen before the 2008 crisis, even though lending standards are tighter today. First-time buyers are pushed out not by reckless borrowing, but by math that no longer works. Ownership becomes inheritance-dependent. Mobility freezes. A foundational promise quietly breaks. Credit fills the gap. Federal Reserve data from 2024 shows revolving credit balances hitting record highs. Delinquencies are rising, not catastrophically, but steadily. Auto loan defaults, especially among subprime borrowers, have drawn repeated warnings from the New York Fed. Credit cards are no longer a bridge between paychecks. They are a substitute for wage growth that didn't arrive. This is not excess, it's compensation. Student debt never left the system. Even after payment pauses ended, balances remain largely intact. The Department of Education's own figures show millions back in repayment, with little principal reduction to show for it. For younger Americans, this debt delays homes, families, and risk-taking. For older Americans, it lingers into middle age, reshaping careers around obligation rather than opportunity. At the federal level, the same logic scales up. Interest payments on U.S. debt now rival or exceed spending on major public programs. Treasury data confirms that more federal dollars flow to creditors than to many visible services voters argue over nightly. This money doesn't circulate locally. It doesn't raise productivity. It closes a loop. The emotional signal is unmistakable. Americans are working more hours and stacking side jobs, yet reporting lower confidence in their future. Savings accounts grow in nominal terms, but lose purchasing power after inflation and taxes. Retirees watch safe assets, bonds, fixed income, pensions, deliver less security than promised as rates reset and prices stay high. Younger generations delay milestones not by choice, but by arithmetic. Older generations realize that preservation, not growth, is now the fight. Listen closely, and the language changes. People don't say the system is failing. They say it feels rigged. Not because someone cheated, but because effort no longer maps cleanly to outcome. The rules seem intact. The results don't add up. This is the tell. These are not isolated policy mistakes or temporary distortions. They are symptoms of a system under debt pressure, where servicing the past takes priority over building the future. The economy still moves. The indicators still print, but the strain is transferred downward, quietly, into time, choices, and trust. And once a system starts doing that, history shows it doesn't correct easily. It adjusts by extracting more from the present to protect the promises already made. This has happened before. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. To see it clearly, the camera has to pull back far enough that pride disappears. Consider Rome at its height. Trade routes stitched 3 continents together. The denarius functioned as a unit of account across borders. Legions enforced stability from Britain to the Levant. Confidence wasn't manufactured. It was earned through centuries of expansion and administration. Rome did not doubt its permanence. It assumed it. The British Empire carried the same posture 2 millennia later. Sterling settled global trade. London financed the world. The Royal Navy secured sea lanes, and insurance markets priced risk for every major port. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain was the hub, commercially, militarily, culturally. Its debt was considered manageable because its reach was unmatched. Permanence felt rational. Both systems shared a quiet trait that only becomes obvious in retrospect. Borrowing crept from necessity into habit. War finance blurred into peacetime maintenance. Currency adjustments smoothed political tension. Confidence filled the gaps where reform should have been. None of this felt reckless in the moment. It felt responsible. History doesn't remember how powerful nations felt. It remembers what they couldn't stop once debt took over. In Rome, silver content in coinage thinned over decades, not years. The change was gradual enough that markets adapted rather than revolted. Prices rose, taxes followed, and the state survived until the margin vanished. In Britain, debt accumulated through world wars and imperial management, then collided with slower growth and rising obligations. The empire didn't collapse in a single event. It contracted under pressure, asset by asset, commitment by commitment. Here is the perspective reset. Debt is not a moral failing. It is a structural force. When a dominant power finances its present by borrowing against its future, it buys time at the cost of flexibility. As long as growth outruns obligations, the system absorbs the strain. When it doesn't, choices narrow. A high-contrast image settles in. Gold light catching the edge of a ledger in a dark room. Numbers written with confidence that no longer needs to be defended. This is why the time shift matters. Rome didn't fall because Romans were careless. Britain didn't retreat because Britons forgot how to govern. Shatum both encountered the same constraint. Obligations that grew faster than the capacity to meet them without friction. Once that line was crossed, policy stopped being about preference and became about survival. The lesson isn't that power guarantees collapse. It's that power delays recognition. Debt doesn't announce itself as a threat when a nation sits at the center of the world. It hides inside success, inside trust, inside the assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. That assumption is the trap. And it's the one modern systems walk into believing history was a warning meant for someone else. The financial system is designed to keep you in the dark, but history provides the map to escape the trap. If this insight opened your eyes, hit the like button to help us break through the noise. Share this with someone who needs to see the patterns before the next collapse. And subscribe to master the mechanics of wealth that they don't want you to understand. Don't let your purchasing power disappear in silence. Drop a comment below, and let's discuss the truth the 1% ignores. The illusion always forms during the good years. Before pressure becomes visible, there's a long stretch where everything appears to work. Growth is steady. Trade expands. Living standards rise slowly but reliably. Institutions earn trust because, for a time, they deserve it. In the United States, that stretch ran for decades. After the Cold War, capital flowed inward, supply chains widened, and the dollar became the default language of global commerce. Crises came and went, but recovery followed each time. The lesson absorbed was simple. The system bends, but it doesn't break. That belief shaped behavior. Instead of restructuring when costs were low, the country learned to borrow through disruption. The 2008 financial crisis reset interest rates near zero. The pandemic did the same at a larger scale. Emergency spending became routine, and routine spending became politically untouchable. According to IMF and Treasury data from the last 18 months, deficits persisted even as unemployment fell and corporate profits recovered. Borrowing no longer filled temporary gaps. It sustained the baseline. The critical choice wasn't reckless in appearance. It was incremental. Future output was pledged to preserve present comfort. Debt issuance replaced hard trade-offs. Programs stayed intact. Taxes stayed politically radioactive. Growth was assumed to return fast enough to make the numbers work. When it didn't, refinancing bridged the difference. This is how the illusion locks in. Scale begins to feel like protection. The United States issues the world's reserve currency. Global trade still clears in dollars. Foreign institutions still hold treasuries as collateral. Military reach remains unmatched. Confidence becomes self-reinforcing. We're too big for this to matter. Stop sounding arrogant and start sounding pragmatic. Warning signs were visible, but they lacked drama. The BIS flagged rising sovereign leverage across advanced economies, including the U.S., well before rates reset. The Congressional Budget Office projected interest costs crowding out discretionary spending under multiple scenarios, even optimistic ones. The Federal Reserve, in meeting transcripts from 2024, acknowledged fiscal pressure while treating it as someone else's problem. None of this caused panic. It caused adjustment. Debt was framed as manageable because markets continued to absorb it. Auctions cleared, yields rose, but demand remained. Confidence substituted for solvency. The absence of immediate punishment was mistaken for proof of safety. A stark image forms. A ledger balanced by rolling tomorrow into today, written cleanly, deliberately, without urgency. This phase is the most dangerous because it feels responsible. No one announces failure. Institutions function, payments clear, life goes on. But the structure underneath shifts. Borrowing stops funding expansion and starts funding continuity. Once that happens, delay becomes policy. Pain is deferred because the system still allows it. History shows this moment clearly, but only after it passes. The illusion isn't believing debt exists. It's believing that permanence changes how debt behaves. It doesn't. Scale delays consequences. It never erases them. The mechanism has a name, and once it takes hold, it is brutally consistent. Economists call it the sovereign debt spiral. History remembers it as the moment when motion replaces direction. It begins simply. Governments borrow to cover gaps. Recessions, wars, emergencies, political stalemates. In the early phase, borrowing funds expansion. Roads get built, industries scale, tax bases grow. The debt is justified because it creates capacity that didn't exist before. Growth outruns obligation, and the balance holds. Then the pace changes. Growth slows, not because effort disappears, but because scale matures. Demographics flatten. Productivity gains shrink. Trade no longer expands as freely, yet the obligations remain. Programs created during faster years don't shrink on their own. Neither do entitlements, defense commitments, or interest. According to IMF and CBO projections updated through 2024, U.S. primary deficits persist even under stable economic assumptions. That's the first signal. Borrowing is no longer episodic. It's structural. Interest compounds quietly. Every new bond carries a higher cost than the last. The Federal Reserve's own balance sheet normalization has reinforced this, pushing yields up across the curve. Treasury data shows that average interest rates on new issuance have more than doubled since the low-rate era. This matters because compounding doesn't negotiate, it accelerates. At first, borrowing still feels productive. Funds maintain services, stabilize markets, smooth shocks. Over time, the purpose shifts. Debt stops building the future and starts maintaining the present. roads get patched instead of expanded. Systems are preserved rather than improved. Borrowing fills holes instead of opening paths. This is the critical pivot. When debt exists primarily to service past debt, not to create new capacity, the system flips. The government is no longer investing forward. It is rolling backward obligations forward in time. The distinction is everything. Why this matters is often misunderstood. At this stage, growth is no longer optional. It becomes mandatory. The economy must expand fast enough to keep debt ratios stable, fast enough to reassure creditors, fast enough to prevent interest from crowding out everything else. But growth under mandate behaves differently than growth driven by innovation. It distorts. To force expansion, incentives bend. Asset prices inflate faster than wages. Credit loosens where productivity doesn't. Consumption is pulled forward. Risk is socialized to protect continuity. None of this looks extreme in isolation. Together, they shift the economy toward fragility. The BIS has warned repeatedly over the last year that advanced economies relying on continuous refinancing expose themselves to rollover risk, the need to constantly replace maturing debt at uncertain rates. The United States now issues a growing share of short-term treasuries, increasing sensitivity to rate changes. Each auction clears, but at a cost. Each clearing tightens the box. Rising interest expense makes this visible. In fiscal 2024, federal interest payments surged past levels historically reserved for wartime spending. Treasury figures show interest rivaling or exceeding outlays on major domestic priorities. That money doesn't disappear, but it doesn't circulate productively either. It flows to holders of existing capital, reinforcing imbalance. Fiscal flexibility shrinks as a result. When a larger share of revenue is pre-committed, fewer choices remain. Tax cuts widen deficits. Spending cuts provoke backlash. Inflation becomes the path of least resistance, even when no one names it that way. The Federal Reserve is left tightening into a structure that fiscal policy can't support, a tension acknowledged in recent FOMC discussions without resolution. This is the trap in operational form. The system still moves, markets still function, payments still clear. But policy becomes reactive. Decisions are made to avoid immediate stress rather than to restore balance. The future is pledged incrementally, auction by auction. History shows that once a sovereign reaches this stage, an exit paths narrow sharply. Not because leaders lack intelligence or will, but because the math leaves little room. Debt doesn't need panic to dominate a system. It only needs time, and the absence of reform while time still mattered. Once the mechanism is in motion, the flow becomes visible, not in charts, but in daily life. Money moves upward and forward at the same time. From workers, it flows through taxes that rise quietly and inflation that does the rest. Paychecks get bigger in nominal terms, but the gap between effort and outcome widens. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows real wage growth flattening even as hours worked increase. The loss doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. From savers, money moves sideways and then up. Bank deposits earn less than inflation. Bonds, long treated as protection, reset at prices that punish anyone who bought early. Retirement portfolios recover on paper, but purchasing power doesn't follow cleanly. Those with assets positioned ahead of the curve benefit from rising prices. Those waiting for yield subsidize them. This isn't malice, it's sequencing. From the future, money moves into the present. Borrowing pulls consumption forward. smoothing today by narrowing tomorrow. Treasury issuance replaces deferred reform. According to recent IMF analysis, the United States now relies on sustained future growth to validate current spending levels. The future becomes collateral, pledged in increments small enough to feel invisible. The system responds like machinery under strain. Gears turn faster not to advance, but to avoid stalling. Productivity gains are asked to do more with less margin. Workers are told to reskill, relocate, adapt, while the structure they operate in grows more rigid. Motion becomes the goal, not progress. Pressure builds like water behind a dam. Each refinancing cycle raises the level slightly. As long as the wall holds, the surface looks calm. Credit markets absorb issuance. Auctions clear. Confidence remains. But pressure doesn't disappear because it's contained. It concentrates. Time becomes the loudest signal. A clock ticks beneath policy debates, and it doesn't pause. Debt matures on schedule. Interest compounds on schedule. Demographics shift on schedule. The volume increases as options narrow. The ticking gets louder not because collapse is near, but because flexibility is fading. Here's the clarifying truth. No villain is required. There is no secret committee orchestrating this flow. The system behaves this way because it must. When obligations exceed discretionary capacity, extraction replaces choice. The burden moves to where resistance is lowest. Wages, savings, time. This is why the outcome feels personal, even when the cause is abstract. People sense that they are compensating for something they never voted on. They are. The system doesn't ask permission when it reallocates pressure. It follows the path of least friction. History shows that once flow replaces balance, the process sustains itself. Attempts to reverse it create backlash. Attempts to ignore it deepen the channel. The water keeps rising, the gears keep turning, the clock keeps ticking. What matters is not whether the system is fair. It's whether it still has room to breathe. And that question can only be answered by looking at what comes next. When the same pattern shows up again, somewhere else, with different names and the same math, the pattern doesn't announce itself as history. It disguises itself as an exception. Take Weimar Germany, not at collapse but before it. After World War I, the country still possessed industry, skilled labor, and export capacity. On paper, it could recover. Borrowing escalated first to stabilize society, then to avoid political rupture. Reparations strained the budget, but domestic spending continued. Growth lagged. Interest costs mounted. Confidence held longer than fundamentals justified. Currency trust weakened slowly, then suddenly. The mark didn't fail because leaders were careless. It failed because obligations exceeded what the economy could service without strain. Policymakers chose time over correction, printing to bridge gaps they could not close politically. Social strain followed the math. Savings were erased. When wages lagged prices, extremes filled the vacuum left by credibility. Reform arrived after trust was gone. Different cultures, same structure. Now move forward, not backward, to Japan in the 1990s. No war damage, no hyperinflation, no collapse. Instead, a nation at the technological frontier, flush with savings, confident in its institutions. When the asset bubble burst, borrowing replaced restructuring, public works spending expanded, interest rates fell to zero, debt climbed year after year, justified by stability. Currency trust didn't break, but it thinned. Growth stalled. Productivity gains failed to lift demand. The state absorbed losses to protect continuity. Reform attempts came in waves, always partial, always delayed. Political fracture wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Voters lost faith not in the system's survival, but in its ability to deliver progress. 3 decades later, Japan remains stable and locked in. Debt solved the crisis by freezing the future. Again, different era, same mechanics. Both cases reveal the same sequence. Borrowing escalates to avoid immediate pain. Currency or credit credibility weakens, not necessarily through collapse, but through diminished promise. Social strain rises as the cost of adjustment shifts downward. Attempts at reform arrive after the structure hardens. At that point, options are no longer evaluated on effectiveness, but on tolerability. This is not coincidence. It's not incompetence. It's pattern repetition. The constraint is always the same. Obligations grow faster than the capacity to meet them without distortion. When that happens, policy choices converge. Inflate or extract. Borrow or cut. Delay or fracture. Each option carries cost. None restore flexibility quickly enough once the spiral is established. Modern institutions don't cancel this pattern. They manage it. Central banks smooth volatility. Markets distribute risk. Legal frameworks extend timelines. The underlying math remains untouched. The BIS has been explicit in recent warnings. Prolonged reliance on debt to sustain growth raises systemic fragility even without crisis. Stability becomes brittle. This is why history matters here, not as warning theater, but as instruction. Past systems didn't fail because leaders ignored evidence. They failed because evidence arrived after constraints had already closed in. History doesn't repeat outcomes. It repeats constraints. When you see the same pressures shaping different societies across centuries, borrowing as bridge, confidence as cushion, reform as delay, you're not watching coincidence. You're watching a system behave the only way it can once flexibility is gone. And that recognition collapses distance. Because the pattern doesn't belong to the past. It waits for scale, confidence, and time to line up again. Bring the lens back to the present, and the pattern doesn't fade. It sharpens. The United States now sits on a debt-to-GDP path that, until recently, was associated with crisis states or post-war recoveries. Treasury and IMF data through late 2024 show federal debt well beyond the size of annual output, with projections rising even under optimistic growth assumptions. This isn't the result of a single shock. It's the product of structural deficits that persist in good years and bad. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the gap between spending and revenue remains wide even at near full employment. That detail matters. It means borrowing is no longer counter-cyclical. It's permanent. Demographics tighten the vice. The U.S. population is aging, and the ratio of workers to retirees is falling. Social Security and Medicare obligations expand automatically as payroll growth slows. The trustees' reports issued within the last year make clear that benefit outflows will accelerate regardless of politics. This isn't mismanagement. It's arithmetic meeting time. Productivity was supposed to be the release valve. Instead, it has underperformed. Despite bursts of innovation, broad productivity growth has lagged its late 20th century pace. Federal Reserve research from 2024 points to diffusion problems. Gains concentrated in capital-intensive firms, while the median worker sees little lift. Growth exists, but it doesn't scale evenly enough to outrun obligations. The parallels to history sit in the mechanics. Past empires diluted currency to stretch resources. Silver content fell. Coins multiplied. Trust eroded gradually. Modern systems don't clip coins. They extend balance sheets. Quantitative easing, maturity extension programs, regulatory forbearance. Financial engineering replaces metallurgical debasement. The effect is similar. Purchasing power shifts. Asset prices rise faster than incomes. Stability is purchased by borrowing from the future. This is not a moral judgment. It's a structural comparison. Different tools, same outcome. Time is bought at the cost of flexibility. Look at how pressure is managed now. When rates rise, the Treasury shortens maturities to control costs, increasing rollover exposure. When markets wobble, liquidity facilities appear, framed as temporary but recurring. When banks strain under rate resets, accounting rules adjust. Each move is defensible in isolation. Together, they reveal a system optimizing for continuity over correction. The key observation cuts against instinct. The United States isn't unique. It's not exempt. It's earlier in the curve than most expect. Reserve currency status delays reckoning by widening the buyer base. Military reach reinforces trust. Legal and financial infrastructure deepen markets. All of this buys time. None of it changes the math. History shows that dominant systems feel safest right before flexibility disappears. Confidence peaks when adjustment still seems optional. That's when comparison feels offensive rather than instructive. But the numbers don't care about narrative. Debt grows, interest compounds. Demographics advance, productivity lags. These forces don't align perfectly to trigger collapse. They align to constrain choice. And that's where the United States sits now. Not at the end of the story, but inside the familiar middle, where past empires believed they had years to decide, and discovered later that the decision had already been made for them. The cost doesn't land evenly. It never does. Middle-income households absorb it first, because they sit at the intersection of obligation and exposure. They earn too much to qualify for relief and too little to insulate themselves. Wages rise nominally, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows real gains flattening once housing, insurance, and energy are accounted for. Property taxes climb with assessed values. Health premiums reset upward. Childcare costs remain stubborn. Nothing explodes. Everything tightens. Workers without pricing power feel it next. These are people whose pay is set, not negotiated. Service workers, clerical staff, logistics, public sector employees locked into contracts signed years earlier. When inflation spikes and then cools, their paychecks never catch up. The New York Fed's recent labor market reports show hours worked increasing, even as real compensation stagnates. Effort rises, security doesn't. Savers learn last, and often too late. Safe assets no longer behave the way they were taught. Bank deposits trail inflation. Bonds, once a hedge, delivered losses when rates reset. Retirement portfolios recover in dollar terms, but the cost of living moves faster. Older Americans notice it in groceries, utilities, and medical bills, categories that don't shrink when growth slows. Preservation becomes an active struggle. The lived consequences accumulate quietly. Cost pressure doesn't recede when inflation slows. It locks in at a higher level. Asset inflation continues to outpace wages, pulling ownership further out of reach. CON, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, confirms that home prices remain elevated even as transaction volume drops. Those who already own benefit on paper. Those who don't fall further behind. The ladder doesn't break. it lifts. Economic growth continues, but insecurity grows with it. That's the dissonance people feel. GDP expands while personal margins shrink. Corporate earnings rebound while household buffers thin. Credit fills the gap until it can't. Delinquencies rise at the edges first, as flagged in recent FDIC and Fed data, then move inward. Stress spreads without spectacle. Listen to how people describe it. They don't talk about balance sheets or deficits. They say the system feels unfair, not chaotic, not collapsing. Unfair. Because the rules still apply, but the outcomes no longer track effort. That feeling is accurate and misunderstood. The system isn't broken. It's functioning as designed under strain. When obligations outrun flexibility, pressure is transferred downward. Inflation substitutes for explicit taxation. Asset appreciation substitutes for wage growth. Time substitutes for reform. The costs land where resistance is lowest and visibility is minimal. No announcement is made when this shift occurs. There is no vote. The burden simply moves. This is the human face of the debt mechanism. Not panic, not collapse, adjustment. Families postpone decisions. Workers accept more risk. Savers recalibrate expectations downward. Life continues, just narrower. History shows that this phase lasts longer than expected and leaves deeper marks than crisis ever does. Because when a system extracts quietly, people adapt until they can't. There is a point where adjustment hardens into lock-in. It isn't marked by a crisis or a downgrade. It arrives when debt servicing demands a level of growth that the society cannot sustain without tearing itself apart. At that stage, expansion isn't pursued to improve life. It's pursued to keep the structure standing. The IMF's most recent assessments of advanced economies, including the United States, warn that once interest costs consume a rising share of revenue, fiscal choices become constrained regardless of political intent. Growth becomes compulsory, even when its side effects are destabilizing. That is the point of no return, not collapse but compulsion. History shows why reversal fails from here. Austerity looks clean on paper. Cut spending, raise taxes, restore balance. In practice, it fractures politics before it fixes math. Britain learned this in the interwar years. Southern Europe relearned it after the global financial crisis. Cuts land faster than benefits. Social cohesion erodes. Governments fall. The policy rarely survives long enough to work. Inflation offers a quieter exit. Debts shrink in real terms. Revenues rise nominally. The burden diffuses across the population, but inflation erodes trust. Savers are punished. Contracts lose meaning. The Federal Reserve understands this risk. It is why credibility is defended so fiercely. Once households and markets stop believing that prices will hold, behavior changes permanently. Rebuilding that trust takes decades. Default is the blunt instrument. It clears the ledger at the cost of reputation. Access to capital vanishes. Trade terms worsen. Influence recedes. For reserve currency issuers, an outright default is unthinkable, not because it's impossible, but because the damage would be systemic. Credibility, once lost, does not return on schedule. These are the historical limits. Every path out carries a cost large enough to threaten stability. That's why systems linger in the middle, managing rather than resolving, extending rather than repairing. The BIS has described this state as one where policy space exists in theory, but not in practice. The math allows options, society doesn't. This is the core lesson. And it's uncomfortable because it removes drama. This is not a prediction of imminent collapse. It's a pattern that repeats when scale, confidence, and time align the same way. The United States is not exempt. It is experienced. The danger isn't ignorance. The data is public. The warnings are issued. The danger is belief. The belief that dominance changes arithmetic. That innovation alone can outrun obligation. That history breaks its own rules for exceptional powers. Empires don't collapse because they ignore history. They collapse because they believe this time is different. Seeing the pattern doesn't guarantee escape, but not seeing it guarantees repetition.